The first time I saw my dead husband alive was at the funeral of my second husband, on a gray October morning that had been threatening rain since dawn. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, pressing down on the cemetery like a lid on a coffin. The air was cold and damp, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you will never be warm again. I was standing at the graveside, my hands clasped in front of me, my fingers numb despite the black leather gloves I was wearing. My eyes were fixed on the polished oak coffin that held the body of the man I had married 8 years ago, the man who had been my second chance at happiness, the man who had stepped into my life when I was still drowning in grief and had pulled me back to the surface. His name was Daniel, and he had been kind and patient and good, everything I had needed when I was broken and lost. And now he was dead, taken by a heart attack that had been as sudden as it was cruel, and I was standing in a cemetery again, saying goodbye to another man I loved. The minister was speaking, his voice a low, solemn drone that blended with the rustle of dead leaves and the distant cry of a crow. I wasn't listening to the words. I had heard them all before, at other funerals, for other people I had loved and lost. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The Lord is my shepherd. He is in a better place now. They were just sounds, empty and hollow, meant to fill the silence and give the living something to hold on to. But they never brought me comfort. They never brought anyone comfort. They were just words, and words were not enough to fill the void that death left behind. The crowd around me was large, larger than I had expected. Daniel had been well loved, a pillar of the community, a man who had touched the lives of everyone he met. There were colleagues from his law firm, friends from the country club, neighbors from our quiet suburban street. My daughter Sophie was beside me, her arm linked through mine, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was 22 now, a grown woman with a life of her own, but in that moment she looked like a child again, lost and frightened and clinging to her mother for comfort. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but I couldn't find the words, because I wasn't sure that anything would ever be okay again. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, half hidden behind a large marble monument that marked the grave of some long-forgotten family. The monument was old and weathered, its inscription worn away by decades of rain and wind, and he was using it as a shield, as if he didn't want to be seen. He was tall, taller than most of the people around him, and his dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, just as it had been the last time I saw him, 10 years ago, when I had leaned over his hospital bed and watched him take his last breath. His face was older, more lined, the face of a man who had lived a hard life and carried heavy burdens. But there was no mistaking those features. The sharp jaw, the high cheekbones, the pale gray eyes that had once looked at me with love and desire and 1,000 unspoken promises. I would have recognized him anywhere, in any crowd, at any distance. Because he was not just any man. He was the first man I had ever loved. He was the father of my child. And he had been dead for 10 years. The world stopped. The minister's voice faded into silence. The crowd of mourners blurred into an indistinct mass of black and gray. The only thing I could see was him, standing there, looking at me with those pale gray eyes that I had thought I would never see again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, in my wrists, in the base of my throat where my pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. My legs felt weak, and I reached out instinctively, grasping Sophie's arm, my gloved fingers digging into the sleeve of her coat. "Mom." Sophie's voice was concerned, her hand covering mine. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. I couldn't do anything except stare at the man who had been dead for 10 years, the man whose body I had identified at the morgue, the man whose casket I had watched being lowered into the cold, hard ground, the man whose grave I had visited every year on the anniversary of his death, laying flowers on the grass and whispering words of love and regret. He was here. He was alive. And he was looking at me. Our eyes met across the crowded cemetery, and for a moment, time seemed to collapse in on itself. 10 years vanished in an instant, and I was 30 years old again, standing in a hospital room, holding his hand, watching the machines that were keeping his body alive. The doctors had told me there was nothing they could do. The accident had been too severe, the injuries too extensive. He was brain dead, they said. The machines were breathing for him, pumping his blood, keeping his organs functioning, but there was no brain activity, no consciousness, no hope of recovery. He was gone, they said. The man I loved was gone, and all that remained was a shell, a body that was being kept alive by technology and tubes, and the stubborn refusal of his heart to stop beating. I had to make the decision, the terrible, impossible decision, to let him go. And I had. I had signed the papers, my hand trembling so badly I could barely hold the pen. I had stood by his bedside as they turned off the machines, one by one, watching the monitors go dark, listening to the steady beep of his heartbeat, slow and then stop. I had held his hand as he died, my tears falling on his face, my lips pressed against his forehead, whispering goodbye. I had felt the life leave his body, felt the warmth drain from his skin, felt the final, terrible stillness that told me he was gone. But now he was standing in front of me, 30 yards away, as alive and as real as the ground beneath my feet. His eyes held mine for a long, terrible moment, and I saw a recognition flare in them. He knew me. He recognized me. Even after all these years, even with the gray in my hair and the lines on my face and the black dress of a widow. He knew exactly who I was. And then he turned and walked away. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I dropped Sophie's arm and began to push through the crowd, shoving past mourners who turned to stare at me with expressions of shock and confusion. I could hear voices calling my name, my daughter's voice, my friends' voices, the minister's voice, but I ignored them all. The only thing that mattered was him, the man who was walking away from me with long, purposeful strides, disappearing into the maze of tombstones and monuments. "Michael!" I shouted, my voice cracking, the name tearing itself from my throat like a sob. "Michael, wait. Please." He didn't stop. He didn't even look back. He just kept walking, faster now, his dark coat flapping behind him, his figure growing smaller and smaller as he made his way toward the cemetery gates. I tried to run, but my legs were weak and my heels sank into the wet grass, and I stumbled, nearly falling. Sophie caught my arm, her face twisted with confusion and fear. "Mom, what's wrong? Who are you shouting at?" I didn't answer. I pulled my arm free and kept going, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the stares and the whispers and the hands that reached out to stop me. But by the time I reached the edge of the cemetery, he was gone, vanished through the iron gates, swallowed by the gray morning mist. The street beyond was empty, just a row of parked cars and the bare branches of trees reaching up toward the colorless sky. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. Had I really seen him? Or was it a hallucination, a trick of the light, a grief-induced vision brought on by the stress of burying my second husband? It was possible. It was more than possible. It was the only explanation that made any sense. Because the alternative, the truth, was too impossible to accept. Michael was dead. Michael had been dead for 10 years. I had watched him die. I had buried him. I had mourned him. He could not be alive. And yet, I knew what I had seen. I knew those eyes, that face, that walk. It was him. It was Michael. And he had recognized me. He had looked at me, and he had known me, and he had chosen to walk away. The rest of the funeral passed in a blur. I don't remember the final prayer or the lowering of the coffin or the sound of dirt hitting the polished wood. I don't remember the condolences or the embraces or the well-meaning words of comfort from people who thought they understood my grief. I was there physically, standing in the receiving line, shaking hands and accepting hugs, but my mind was elsewhere. My mind was with Michael, chasing him through the graveyard, demanding answers to questions I couldn't even formulate. Why was he alive? Where had he been for 10 years? Why had he let me believe he was dead? And why, when he saw me, had he walked away? I told no one what I had seen. Not my daughter. Not my friends. Not the minister or the funeral director or anyone else. I kept it to myself, locked it away in the darkest corner of my heart, because I knew how it would sound. I knew that people would think I was crazy, that the grief of losing 2 husbands had finally broken me, that I was seeing things that weren't really there, I knew that no one would believe me, and so I said nothing, and I smiled, and I played the part of the grieving widow, even as my mind was consumed by the impossible. That night, alone in the house I had shared with Daniel, I sat in the darkness and thought about Michael. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you and makes you feel like you're suffocating. Daniel's things were still everywhere, his books on the shelves, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his favorite mug in the kitchen cabinet. He had only been dead for 2 weeks, and the house still felt like he might walk through the door at any moment. But he wouldn't. He was gone, just like Michael was gone. Except Michael wasn't gone. Michael was alive, out there somewhere, living a life I knew nothing about. I thought about the day we met. It was a spring afternoon, and I was 25 years old, sitting in a coffee shop near the university where I was working on my master's degree. I was reading a book, something dense and academic that I was supposed to be studying for a class, but my mind kept wandering. And then he walked in, tall and confident, with that easy smile that made my heart skip a beat. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, and as he turned away from the counter, he bumped into my table, spilling my latte all over my new sweater and my expensive textbook. He was mortified. He apologized profusely, grabbing napkins and trying to help me clean up the mess, his face red with embarrassment. I should have been angry. I should have been annoyed. But instead, I found myself laughing. There was something about his flustered sincerity, the way he looked at me with those pale gray eyes, that made it impossible to be upset. We talked for hours that afternoon, sitting at a corner table, ignoring the world around us. By the time I left that coffee shop, I knew I was going to marry him. And I did, 2 years later, in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. It was the happiest day of my life, or so I believed at the time. Michael looked at me as if I were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and when he said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I will love you forever," he said. "No matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, I will always find my way back to you." Those words echoed in my mind now, a bitter irony. He had promised to find his way back to me, but instead, he had disappeared, faked his own death, and let me grieve for him for 10 years. And now, when he finally did come back, he had walked away without a word. The days that followed were a haze of grief and confusion. I went through the motions of my life, answering condolence calls and sorting through Daniel's affairs and trying to be strong for Sophie. But underneath the surface, I was falling apart. The image of Michael standing at the edge of that crowd was burned into my memory, as vivid and as real as anything I had ever seen. I knew it was him. I knew it with a certainty that went beyond logic, beyond evidence, beyond anything that could be explained by grief or stress or the tricks of the mind. It was Michael. It was my husband. He was alive, and I needed to find him. I started with the obvious places. The places we used to go together, the places that had meant something to us as a couple. The coffee shop where we met, which had changed ownership twice, but still served the same terrible espresso. The park where we had our first picnic, where we had spread a blanket on the grass and talked until the sun went down. The restaurant where we had celebrated our anniversaries, a little Italian place with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. I went to each of them, day after day, sitting in corners and watching the door, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face. But he was never there. Or if he was, I didn't see him. I searched online, scouring social media and public records for any trace of him. There was nothing. No obituary, no death certificate, no memorial page. It was as if he had been erased from the world, his existence wiped clean like a chalkboard. But I knew he was out there, somewhere. I knew he was alive. And I knew that he had seen me, recognized me, and chosen to walk away. The question that consumed me, the question that kept me awake at night and haunted my dreams, was why? Why had he let me believe he was dead? Why had he disappeared without a trace? And why, after 10 years of hiding, had he chosen that moment, that place, to reveal himself? The answer, when it finally came, was more terrible than anything I could have imagined. It came in the form of a letter delivered to my door on a cold November morning, 3 weeks after the funeral. I found it wedged between the screen door and the frame, A single envelope with no stamp and no return address. Just my name written on the front in handwriting that I recognized immediately. Michael's handwriting. The same neat, precise letters that I had seen on birthday cards and love notes and grocery lists for the 7 years of our marriage. My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on that paper, just a few lines of text. "I'm sorry," the letter read. "I never wanted you to see me. I came to pay my respects, and I didn't know you would be there. I should have known. I should have stayed away. But I needed to see you, just once, even from a distance. Please don't try to find me. It's better this way. It's safer this way. For you, and for Sophie. Forget you ever saw me. Move on with your life. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. Goodbye." I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. "Forget you ever saw me. Move on with your life. Be happy." The words were so final, so absolute, so dismissive of everything we had shared. How could he ask me to forget? How could he ask me to move on? He was my husband. He was the father of my child. He had been dead for 10 years, and now he was alive, and he wanted me to pretend that none of it had ever happened. I didn't forget. I didn't move on. I did the opposite. I hired a private investigator, a discreet professional named Sarah Chun who had a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found. I gave her the letter, told her everything I knew, and asked her to find Michael. She listened without judgment, her expression neutral and professional, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I'll do my best," she said. "But I have to warn you, these cases can be difficult. If your husband doesn't want to be found, there's a good chance he won't be. People who fake their own deaths usually have a reason, and they usually know how to cover their tracks." "I understand," I said, "but I have to try. I have to know the truth. I've spent 10 years grieving for a man who wasn't dead. I need to understand why. I need to look him in the eye and ask him how he could do this to me. To us. To our daughter." Sarah studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "I'll do everything I can, but I want you to prepare yourself for the possibility that the truth might be more complicated than you expect. The man you find might not be the man you remember." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what she meant. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, Sarah called me with news. She had found him. Michael was living in a small town 3 hours away, under a different name, working as a carpenter. He had a wife, a woman he had married 5 years ago, and 2 young children. He was living a whole other life, a life that didn't include me or Sophie. I felt the world tilt around me as Sarah spoke. A new name, a new wife, a new family. It was like hearing about a stranger, not the man I had loved and mourned. But the picture Sarah showed me, a grainy photograph taken from a distance, left no room for doubt. It was Michael, my Michael, living a life that I knew nothing about. "I need to see him," I said, my voice breaking. "I need to talk to him. I need to understand." "I can arrange a meeting," Sarah said. "But I'd advise you to be careful. If he's been hiding for 10 years, there might be reasons you don't know about. Reasons that could put you in danger. This isn't just about a man who ran away from his marriage. This is something deeper, something more complicated." But I didn't care about danger. I didn't care about anything except the truth. And so, on a cold December morning, I drove 3 hours to a small town I had never heard of, to a house I had never seen, to confront the ghost who had haunted my life for a decade. The town was small and quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else and strangers were noticed immediately. Michael's house was at the end of a tree-lined street, a modest 2-story home with a porch swing and a garden that had been put to bed for the winter. There was a child's bicycle in the driveway and a basketball hoop mounted above the garage. It was a family home, warm and welcoming, the kind of place that spoke of stability and happiness and everything I had lost. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the house, trying to summon the courage to get out. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, I didn't know what to do. What do you say to a ghost? How do you confront a man who has been dead for 10 years? In the end, I didn't have to decide. The front door opened, and he stepped out onto the porch. He was older than he had been at the funeral, tired and worn, with dark circles under his eyes and a slump to his shoulders that spoke of a heavy burden. He didn't look surprised to see me. He just looked sad. Profoundly, endlessly sad. "Claire," he said, his voice quiet and heavy with regret. "I knew you would find me eventually." I got out of the car, my legs unsteady, my heart in my throat. "Why?" I asked, the word coming out as a sob. "Why did you do it? Why did you let me believe you were dead?" He closed his eyes, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, very quietly, "Because I had to. Because it was the only way to keep you safe." And then he told me the truth. The terrible, impossible truth that I had never suspected. The accident had not been an accident. The crash that had put him in the hospital, the injuries that had nearly killed him, they had been deliberate. Someone had been trying to kill him, someone dangerous, someone who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Michael had been involved in something he couldn't explain, something that had put our entire family at risk. And the only way to protect me, to protect Sophie, was to disappear, to fake his own death, to become someone else entirely. "The people who wanted me dead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they don't give up. They don't forget. If they knew I was still alive, they would come for me. And they would come for you. For Sophie. For everyone I love. I couldn't let that happen. I had to make them believe I was gone." "But you're here," I said, my voice breaking. "You're alive. And you have a wife. Children. A whole life. How could you do that? How could you move on without me?" "I haven't moved on," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Not really. Every day, I think about you. Every day, I think about Sophie. Every day, I wonder what my life would have been like if I had made different choices. But I can't go back. I can't undo what I did. All I can do is try to protect the people I love, even if it means staying away from them." I stood on that porch, tears streaming down my face, and I looked at the man I had loved and lost and found again. He had sacrificed everything, his identity, his family, his entire life, to keep me safe. And in doing so, he had broken my heart. But now, finally, after 10 years of grief and guilt and unanswered questions, I understood. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't stopped loving me. He had just loved me enough to let me go. "I forgive you," I said, my voice barely audible. "I forgive you, Michael. For everything." He looked at me, his pale gray eyes glistening with tears, and for a moment, I saw the man I had married, the man who had promised to love me forever. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know how much that means to me." We stood there for a long time, two people bound together by love and loss and the terrible choices that life had forced upon us. And then, slowly, painfully, I turned and walked away. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew it was the right thing to do. Michael had a new life now, a new family, and I had no place in it. But I would carry his love with me always, a secret treasure hidden in the deepest part of my heart. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt something that I had thought I would never feel again. Peace.